The rain fell in Harlem like a whispered confession, soft but relentless, pooling in the cracks of the sidewalk outside Lucy Brooks's third-floor apartment. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of chamomile tea gone cold, the faint hum of a jazz record spinning in the corner, and a silence that clung to her like a second skin. Lucy, a 29-year-old urban planner, with skin the color of warm mahogany, sat curled on her couch, her knees tucked under a frayed quilt her mother had stitched years ago. Her dark curls spilled over her shoulders, framing a face that was beautiful, but tired eyes that once sparkled with ambition, now dulled by a heartbreak that refused to fade. 3 months ago, her fiancé Marcus had walked out of her life with nothing more than a half-hearted apology and a vague promise to figure himself out. The wedding dress still hung in her mother's Brooklyn closet, a ghost of a future that never arrived. She traced the rim of her mug, her fingers trembling slightly as she stared at the phone on the coffee table. No new messages, no missed calls, just the weight of absence. Lucy had always been the woman with a planned degree from Howard, a steady job at the Harlem Community Center, a vision for a life built on love and purpose. But Marcus had shattered that blueprint, leaving her to piece together a new one alone. The nights were the hardest, when the city's pulse seemed to mock her stillness, when the memories of shared laughter and whispered promises crept in uninvited. She'd stopped going to Sunday brunches, with friends dodged her mother's probing questions, and buried herself in work, designing green spaces for kids who deserved better than concrete and chaos. Tonight, though, something felt different. The rain wasn't just a backdrop. It was a rhythm, a nudge, as if the universe was trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. Lucy stood her bare feet cold against the hardwood and crossed to the window. Harlem stretched out below, alive with neon signs and the hum of late-night taxis. She pressed her forehead to the glass, her breath fogging the pain, and whispered to herself, "You're still here. You're still enough." But the words felt hollow, like a prayer she didn't quite believe. A sharp knock at the door jolted her. She froze her heart, tripping over itself. It was past 9, too late for deliveries, too late for her mother to drop by unannounced. She padded to the door, her oversized sweater slipping off one shoulder, and peered through the peephole. Amara Jackson, her colleague and self-appointed guardian angel, stood in the hallway, her locks pulled into a high bun, her grin wide enough to light up the dim corridor. Lucy sighed, both relieved and exasperated, and opened the door. "Girl, you look like you're auditioning for a sad jazz album cover," Amara said, stepping inside, without invitation. Her brown skin glowed under the hallway light, her energy as unapologetic as the red lipstick she wore. She carried a garment bag slung over her arm, the kind that promised trouble. "I'm fine, Amara," Lucy said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. She crossed her arms, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. "Just tired." Amara raised an eyebrow, tossing the garment bag onto the couch. "You're not tired, Lucy Brooks. You're hiding, and I'm not having it." She moved to the kitchenette, rummaging through Lucy's cabinets, like she owned the place. "Where's your wine? You're gonna need a glass for what I'm about to say." Lucy leaned against the wall, a faint smile tugging at her lips, despite herself. Amara had been her rock at the community center, a 32-year-old firecracker who taught art classes to teens and never let Lucy wallow for too long. "I don't need wine," Lucy said. "I need peace." "Peace," Amara snorted, pulling out a bottle of Merlot Lucy had forgotten about. "Peace is what you get when you're dead. Right now you need life." She poured 2 glasses, handing one to Lucy with a look that said refusal wasn't an option. "Tomorrow night there's an art gallery opening in SoHo. Big deal, fancy folks, jazz band, the works. You're coming with me." Lucy shook her head, setting the glass down untouched. I'm not in the mood for crowds, Amara. You know that. I'm not asking. I'm telling. Amara said, her voice softening but firm. She unzipped the garment bag, revealing a crimson dress that shimmered like it was made of liquid fire. This is for you. Try it on. Let it remind you who you are. Lucy stared at the dress, its bold hue a stark contrast to the muted grays of her world. It's too much, she murmured, her fingers brushing the fabric. It was silk smooth and daring, the kind of dress that demanded attention she wasn't sure she could give. It's exactly enough, Amara countered, stepping closer. Her eyes softened, seeing the pain Lucy tried to hide. Listen, I know Marcus broke something in you. I know you're scared to feel again. But you can't heal in the dark, Lucy. You gotta step into the light, even if it burns a little. Lucy's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to crawl back under her quilt and let the rain drown out the world. But Amara's words hit something raw, something that refused to stay buried. She thought of the wedding dress, the empty promises, the nights spent wondering if she'd ever be enough. Maybe Amara was right. Maybe one night could be a start, not a solution, but a spark. Fine, Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. But if I hate it, I'm blaming you. Amara grinned, clapping her hands like she'd won a battle. That's my girl. Tomorrow, 7 sharp, I'll pick you up and we're gonna turn SoHo upside down. Lucy managed a small laugh, the sound foreign but warm. She looked at the dress again, its red glowing like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. What if I'm not ready? She asked, her eyes meeting Amara's. You're readier than you think, Amara said, squeezing her shoulder. And that dress? It's not just fabric, it's armor. Wear it like you mean it. As Amara left, the apartment felt less suffocating, the rain less oppressive. Lucy held the dress up to the light, watching it catch the glow of the street lamps outside. Somewhere in the city, a man named Charles Sanders, a 34-year-old real estate tycoon with skin pale as moonlight and eyes that carried the weight of 1,000 deals, was preparing for the same SoHo gallery opening. He didn't know it yet, but his world was about to collide with hers. Two strangers on a collision course with fate. Lucy didn't know his name, his wealth, or the storm he carried in his tailored suit. All she knew was the whisper in her gut, telling her to step out, to try to live. Tomorrow, she whispered to the empty room, the dress still in her hands. Just one night. The SoHo gallery pulsed with life, its exposed brick walls bathed in the golden glow of pendant lights, the air thick with the scent of cedarwood cologne and crisp champagne. Jazz notes from a live quartet wove through the crowd, a sultry saxophone curling around conversations like smoke. Lucy Brooks, 29. Her mahogany skin catching the light in a crimson dress that clung to her curves like a lover's promise, stood at the edge of the room, her heart a quiet drumbeat against the chaos. She felt like an outsider in this glittering world of artists, investors, and dreamers, in her Harlem roots, a stark contrast to the polished energy around her. Yet the dress Amara had insisted she wear gave her a kind of courage, its bold hue a shield against the vulnerability she carried. Amara, 32. Her brown skin glowing under a sequined blazer, nudged Lucy forward, her locks swaying as she navigated the crowd with ease. Stop clutching your purse like it's a lifeline, she whispered, her voice teasing but warm. You're here to breathe, not to hide. Lucy forced a smile, her fingers loosening around the leather clutch. The room buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional flash of a camera capturing the elite of New York's art scene. A woman in a silver gown complimented Lucy's gold hoop earrings, and for a moment She felt the weight of her heartbreak lift, replaced by a flicker of something new possibility. She wandered toward a canvas splashed with indigo and gold, its abstract streaks reminding her of Harlem's night sky, fractured, but beautiful. She tilted her head, lost in its depth, when a voice broke her reverie. "It's like staring into a storm, isn't it?" The words were low measured, carrying a warmth that made her turn. Standing a few feet away was Charles Sanders, 34, his pale skin framed by a charcoal suit that fit him like it was tailored by the gods. His green eyes held a quiet intensity, as if he saw more than the room allowed. He was no stranger to these events, a real estate tycoon whose name graced Manhattan's skyline, yet he stood alone, hands in his pockets, watching the crowd with a detachment that mirrored her own. Lucy blinked, caught off guard by the way his gaze settled on her, not predatory, but curious, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "I was thinking more like a broken dream," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But a storm works too." Charles smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that softened the sharp lines of his face. "I'm Charles," he said, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "And you are?" "Lucy," she replied, her heart tripping over itself. She wasn't sure why she felt so exposed under his gaze, as if he could see the cracks Marcus had left behind. "Lucy Brooks." "Lucy," he repeated, testing the name like it was a melody. "First time at one of these?" He gestured to the room, his tone light, but probing. She nodded, brushing a curl behind her ear. "I'm more of a community center kind of girl. This feels like a different planet." He chuckled, the sound low and warm, like whiskey on a cold night. "I get it. I fund these things, but half the time I'm just pretending to understand the art." He leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I once said a sculpture looked like urban chaos. The artist didn't speak to me for a month." Lucy laughed, the sound surprising her. It was the first real laugh she'd let out in weeks, and it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You're not selling yourself as a connoisseur," she teased. "Maybe not," he said, his eyes crinkling. "But I'm honest. That's gotta count for something." They fell into conversation effortless, in a way that caught Lucy off guard. She told him about her work at the Harlem Community Center, how she designed parks for kids to dream, in her voice growing animated as she spoke of green spaces cutting through concrete. Charles listened, really listened, his gaze never wavering, his questions sharp but kind. He shared glimpses of his world boardrooms in Midtown, deals that shaped cities, a childhood spent under the weight of his father's expectations. Despite their different worlds, her Harlem roots and his Upper East Side empire, they found a rhythm, a shared language in dreams and quiet rebellion. The jazz band shifted to a slower tempo, a languid saxophone weaving through the air. Charles tilted his head, a question in his eyes. Would it be too forward to ask for a dance? Lucy hesitated, her pulse quickening. She hadn't danced with anyone since Marcus hadn't let anyone close enough to try. But something about Charles, his quiet confidence, the way he didn't push, made her want to say yes. "Only if you promise not to step on my toes," she said, a playful edge to her voice. He grinned, offering his hand. "No promises, but I'll try." They moved to the center of the room, the crowd parting like water around them. His hand rested lightly on her waist, her fingers finding his shoulder, the crimson dress swaying as they moved. The music wrapped them in a cocoon, the world fading until it was just the two of them swaying under the soft glow of the lights. Lucy's breath caught as she felt the warmth of his hand, the steady rhythm of his steps. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking of Marcus, of the wedding that never happened. She was here, alive, present. "You're good at this," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the music. Years of boring galas, he said, his breath brushing her ear. But this doesn't feel boring. Her cheeks warmed, and she looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no arrogance there, no agenda, just a quiet awe that mirrored her own. The song ended, but neither pulled away. The air between them crackled, charged with something neither could name. Then Charles leaned in his lips, brushing hers in a kiss that was soft, tentative, but electric. Lucy froze for a heartbeat, then leaned into it, her hands tightening on his shoulders. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a spark, a moment that felt like it could rewrite everything. When they pulled back, their eyes locked, breathless. I don't usually do this, Lucy whispered, her voice trembling with honesty. Neither do I, Charles said, his hand still lingering on her waist. But I don't want this to end here. They stepped outside the cool SoHo air, kissing Lucy's bare shoulders. The city hummed around them, headlights flashing, laughter spilling from nearby bars. Charles offered his jacket, draping it over her, with a care that made her heart stutter. They walked in silence, her heels clicking against the pavement, his steps slowing to match hers. The night felt fragile, like a dream that could dissolve with the morning. But as they stopped near a quiet fountain, the water glinting under streetlights, Charles turned to her, his pale skin catching the glow, his eyes searching hers. I know we just met, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, a rare hint of nervousness breaking through his polished exterior. But I'd like to see you again, Lucy. Not here, not in a crowd, just you. She studied him, the man who seemed to carry a world she didn't belong to, yet made her feel like she did. Her heart whispered caution, but her soul screamed, yes. Maybe she said, a small smile playing on her lips. Let's see what the night decides. The Upper East Side penthouse was a world of glass and steel, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing Manhattan's skyline like a living canvas. Lucy Brooks, 29. Her mahogany skin still flushed from the night before, stirred beneath a soft throw blanket on Charles Sanders' sprawling couch. The morning light spilled across her bare shoulder, catching the faint sheen of sweat on her skin. She blinked awake, her heart a quiet hum of something she couldn't name, relief perhaps, or the ghost of a thrill. At 34, Charles, his pale skin glowing under the dawn's touch, slept beside her, his arm draped loosely around her waist. His face, usually sharp with the weight of boardroom decisions, was soft in sleep, almost boyish. The air smelled of his cedar cologne and the faint musk of their shared night, a memory that felt too vivid to be real. Lucy slipped from his grasp, careful not to wake him, and padded across the hardwood floor, her bare feet cold against its polished surface. She wore his oversized white dress shirt, the sleeves swallowing her wrists, its crisp fabric a stark contrast to her crimson dress, now draped over a chair. She paused by the window, the city waking below taxis, honking joggers threading through Central Park's edges. Last night had been a spark, a reckless surrender, to a man who saw her, really saw her, in a way Marcus never had. But as she stood there, a flicker of unease crept in, sharp and uninvited. Her eyes fell to the small wastebasket by the couch, where a torn condom wrapper lay, discarded, its edge split, in a way that made her breath catch. She crouched, her fingers trembling, as she picked it up, squinting in the golden light. The tear wasn't just at the side, it was at the tip, a jagged betrayal of trust in their careful moment. Her pulse quickened, a cold wave of fear washing over her. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if saying it louder would make it true. She glanced back at Charles, still asleep, his pale chest rising and falling with a peace she no longer felt. This was supposed to be one night, a fleeting escape from her heartbreak, not a tether to a new kind of chaos. She stood wrapping the blanket tighter around her and slipped into the bathroom, needing space to think. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, eyes wide with panic, curls tangled from the night, her dark skin glowing despite the storm in her chest. She splashed cold water on her face, whispering, "It's fine. It's probably fine." But the words felt like a lie. She cleaned up her movements mechanical and returned to the living room, slipping back into her dress. The city outside moved on, oblivious to the weight now pressing against her ribs. She gathered her things, purse, heels, phone, and paused by the couch, looking down at Charles. His kindness last night, the way he'd listened, the way he'd touched her like she was something precious, lingered in her mind. She leaned down, brushing a soft kiss against his forehead. He stirred, murmuring, "I'll call you," his voice thick with sleep. "You better." Lucy whispered more to herself than to him. She slipped out the elevator ride down, feeling like a descent into a new reality. The morning air hit her like a slap as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Charles's shirt still tucked into her purse, its scent clinging to her like a memory she couldn't shake. Harlem felt a world away as she called a rideshare, her mind spinning with what-ifs. What if this wasn't just a mistake? What if it was everything? Weeks passed in a blur of routine meetings at the Harlem Community Center, late nights, sketching park designs, forced smiles for colleagues who didn't know the storm brewing inside her. Lucy, 29, had always been precise. Her life mapped out like the urban grids she planned. But now her body betrayed that precision. She noticed it first in the mornings, a faint nausea that lingered like an unwelcome guest. By day 6, her calendar mocked her. Her cycle, always punctual, was late. By day 8, dread had settled into her bones. Standing in her cramped Harlem bathroom, she stared at the pharmacy bag on the counter, its contents heavier than the paper it was made of. 2 pregnancy tests unopened, weighted like a verdict. She hadn't called Charles since that morning. He'd texted twice, simple, kind messages asking how she was, but she'd left them unanswered, afraid that speaking to him would make this real. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, her dark hands clutching the bag, her breath shallow. "Just do it," she muttered, tearing open the first test. The instructions were clinical, sterile. 5 minutes, 1 line for no, 2 for yes. She followed them, set the test on the counter, and walked out, pacing her small apartment. The hardwood creaked under her feet, the jazz record she'd played that first night silent now. 5 minutes stretched into an eternity, each second a hammer against her nerves. When she returned, the test stared back at her 2 pink lines, stark and undeniable. Her knees buckled, and she caught the counter, her reflection blurring in the mirror. Tears welled but didn't fall. Her body was too busy processing the truth. She was pregnant. With the child of a man she barely knew, a man whose pale skin and tailored suits belonged to a world she'd never touched. The memory of that night flooded back, not the passion, but the quiet moments after, his hand brushing her curls, his voice whispering, "You're beautiful." She'd felt safe then. Now she felt exposed. Lucy sank to the floor, the test clattering beside her. She thought of her mother Diane in Brooklyn, who'd raised her with faith and grit. She thought of Amara, who'd pushed her into that crimson dress, into that night. And she thought of Charles, 34, whose life was skyscrapers and boardrooms, not diapers and doubts. Could she do this alone? Could she tell him? Her phone sat on the counter, its screen dark but heavy with possibility. She reached for it, her fingers hovering over his name. Silence wasn't a shield anymore. It was a cage. She pressed call, her heart slamming against her ribs. It rang twice. Lucy Charles's voice came through low and warm, tinged with surprise. "Hey, are you okay?" She swallowed her throat tight. "Charles," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. What's wrong?" His tone sharpened, alert, now the grogginess gone. She squeezed her eyes shut, the words clawing at her throat. "I'm pregnant." Silence stretched across the line, not cold, but stunned, like the air before a storm. She heard him exhale, long and shaky. "Lucy," he said slowly, "are you sure I took the test?" 3, actually. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "I didn't plan this. I needed you to know." Another pause, the kind that made time feel elastic. Then his voice came back, steady, grounding. "Okay, I'm here." "Where are you?" "At home at my apartment," she said, her fingers tightening around the phone. "I'm not asking for anything, Charles. You're not alone." He interrupted, his voice firm, but kind. "We'll figure this out, together." Lucy's chest loosened just a fraction as his words settled over her like a lifeline. She didn't know what came next, but in that moment, under the weight of a truth she hadn't chosen, she felt a spark of something new. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. The Greenwich Village Cafe was a haven of soft chatter and roasted espresso, its brick walls lined with mismatched bookshelves that smelled faintly of old paper and dreams. Lucy Brooks, 29. Her mahogany skin catching the warm glow of the pendant lights, sat at a corner table, her fingers tracing the rim of an untouched chamomile tea. Her dark curls were pulled into a loose bun, a few strands framing her face, which carried a quiet resolve beneath the weight of her new reality. Across from her, Charles Sanders, 34, his pale skin stark against his navy blazer, leaned forward, his green eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. The city outside hummed with its usual chaos. Honking taxis, hurried footsteps, but inside the air was thick with the gravity of their conversation, a delicate thread stretched taut between hope and fear. Lucy had chosen this cafe for its familiarity, a place where she'd once sketched park designs over lattes with colleagues from the Harlem Community Center. Now it was neutral ground, a buffer against the storm brewing in her chest. "I didn't expect you to come so fast," she said, her voice low, almost swallowed by the clink of silverware nearby. "I wasn't sure you'd want to." Charles's jaw tightened, his pale fingers wrapping around his coffee cup. "Lucy, you called me. That's enough." He paused, his gaze softening. "I meant what I said. You're not doing this alone." She looked down at her hands, her dark skin a contrast to the white tablecloth, and felt the weight of his words. 3 weeks had passed since she'd told him about the pregnancy. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and whispered doubts. At 29, she'd built a life of purpose, planning green spaces for Harlem's kids, teaching them to dream beyond concrete. But this, a child with a man whose world was glass towers and boardroom deals, was a curve she hadn't planned for. "People are talking," she said, finally, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "At the center in my neighborhood. They think I trapped you, Charles. That I saw a rich white man and made a move." His eyes darkened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "Let them talk. They don't know you. They don't know us." Us. Lucy's voice trembled, a mix of challenge and vulnerability. "We barely know each other. One night doesn't make an us." Charles leaned closer, his voice low, deliberate. "It's more than one night now, Lucy. It's a choice. I'm choosing to be here, and I hope you'll let me." She studied him, the man whose pale skin and tailored suits marked him as an outsider in her world, yet whose presence felt like an anchor. She wanted to believe him, but Harlem's whispers were loud. Neighbors who'd once smiled now gave sidelong glances, colleagues who murmured about gold diggers behind her back. She'd grown up with faith and grit, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. You don't need their approval, but you need your own. But approval wasn't the only threat. 2 days ago, a letter had slipped under her apartment door, its words scrawled in sharp ink. You don't belong in his world. Stay away. No signature, no clue, just a chill that lingered in her bones. Someone left this at my place, she said, sliding the folded note across the table. Her dark fingers trembled slightly as Charles took it, his pale hands steady but tense. He unfolded it, his expression hardening as he read. Who did this? His voice was low, dangerous, like a storm gathering on the horizon. I don't know, Lucy admitted, her eyes meeting his. But it's not just Harlem. Your world's talking too. I heard it at the center, people saying I'm a scandal waiting to happen. Charles set the note down, his jaw clenched. You're not a scandal. You're carrying my child. He reached for her hand, his pale skin brushing against her dark one, a quiet promise in the touch. I'm not letting anyone hurt you, Lucy. Not with words, not with letters. She pulled her hand back, not out of rejection, but fear. You can't stop whispers, Charles, and I can't live under a microscope. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then let me try. Let me protect you. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed a sharp interruption. He glanced at it, then silenced it, but not before Lucy caught the name Eloise. Her stomach twisted, a flash of intuition she couldn't ignore. Who's that? She asked, her voice sharper than intended. Charles hesitated, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. Someone from my past, he said finally. She's not important now. Lucy wanted to press, to demand answers, but the weight of the moment held her back. Instead, she nodded her heart, a tangle of trust and doubt. They sat in silence for a moment, the cafe's warmth a fragile shield against the world outside. Then Charles stood, pulling out his phone. I'm calling my security team, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Until we know who sent that letter, I'm not taking chances. Within an hour, a discreet black SUV was parked outside her Harlem apartment, and a security consultant, named Marcus, ironic Lucy thought, had installed a silent alarm at her door. Charles insisted on walking her home, his pale hand resting lightly on her back as they navigated the bustling streets. The contrast between them drew stares. Her dark skin, his pale complexion, her jeans and sweater against his tailored blazer. But he didn't flinch, didn't pull away. At her door he lingered, his eyes searching hers. I know this feels like too much, he said softly. But I need you to be safe. For you, for the baby. Lucy nodded, her throat tight. I'm not used to this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. People watching. Judging. I just wanted to do my work, live my life. I know, Charles said, his pale fingers brushing a curl from her face. But you're not just anyone's life now. You're part of mine. Her heart stuttered, caught between fear and something warmer, something she wasn't ready to name. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, but his words lingered like the scent of his cologne on her skin. Alone in her apartment, she sank onto the couch, the letter's words echoing in her mind. You don't belong. But as she pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the faint stir of life within, she whispered, I belong to me, and to you. The baby, unnamed and unseen, was her anchor now, a reason to stand tall against the shadows. Across town in his midtown office, Charles sat at his desk, the city's skyline a glittering reminder of his empire. At 34, he'd built a life of control, deals, closed, rivals, silenced, a legacy carved in steel and glass. But the letter in his hand, its words a venomous echo of a world he thought he'd mastered, shook that control. He didn't know who'd sent it, but the name Eloise burned in his mind, a ghost from a past he'd buried. He picked up his phone, his pale fingers hovering over her contact, but he didn't call. Instead, he dialed his security chief, his voice cold. "Find out who's behind this. Now." The night closed around him, but Lucy's face, her strength, her fear, stayed with him, a beacon in the dark. The Brooklyn brownstone smelled of sage and roasted yams, its narrow kitchen alive with the clatter of pots and the soft hum of a gospel tune from Diane Brooks's old radio. Lucy Brooks, 29. Her mahogany skin catching the warm glow of the overhead light stood in the doorway, her hands pressed nervously against her jeans. Her dark curls were swept into a loose ponytail, framing a face that carried both resolve and trepidation. At the stove, Diane, her mother stirred a pot of collard greens, her own brown skin glistening faintly from the heat. The room was a sanctuary of memory, family dinners, late-night talks. But tonight, it felt like a confessional. Lucy's heart thudded as she prepared to speak a truth that could shift everything. "Mama," Lucy said, her voice catching like a thread on a nail. Diane turned, her eyes narrowing with that maternal instinct that missed nothing. "What is it, baby?" she asked, setting the wooden spoon down with deliberate care. Lucy took a breath, her dark hands twisting together. "I'm pregnant." The words hung heavy like steam, trapped in the air. Diane's face stilled, her lips parting slightly, but she said nothing, waiting. "It's Charles Sanders's." Lucy continued, her voice steadier now. "The man I told you about, from that night in SoHo." Diane sank into a chair, her brown fingers folding tightly in her lap. "Charles Sanders." She repeated the name, carrying the weight of his reputation before, pale-skinned, a real estate titan whose name was etched into Manhattan's skyline. "The one who owns half of Midtown." Lucy nodded, her throat tight. "It wasn't planned, Mama. But it's real. He knows, and he's been there. He wants to be involved." Diane's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with a storm of unspoken thoughts. "Involved," she said, her voice low. "That's a big word for a man you barely know. A white man, Lucy, with a world that don't bend easy for folks like us." "I know," Lucy said, her dark eyes meeting her mother's. "But he's trying. He's not running." Diane leaned back, her gaze searching. "And you? What do you want?" Lucy's hand drifted to her stomach, where the faintest curve hinted at the life within. "I want to keep this baby," she said softly. "I'm scared, but I want this." Diane reached across the table, her brown hand covering Lucy's. "Then we'll walk this road together. But baby, his world ain't ours. You ready for that fight?" Lucy's chest tightened, but she nodded. "I have to be." Across the city, in a sleek midtown office tower, Charles Sanders sat behind a glass desk, the city's pulse throbbing beyond the windows. At 34, his pale skin and sharp features carried the polish of a man who'd mastered control, but today his green eyes were shadowed with unease. A second letter had arrived, not at Lucy's apartment, but slipped into his briefcase, its words sharper than the first. "She's not your future. She's a mistake." No signature, but the elegant cursive screamed Eloise, his ex-lover, whose name had haunted his phone screen weeks ago. He hadn't seen her since their breakup 2 years prior, but her shadow lingered, a reminder of a past he'd thought buried. He stood pacing the polished floor, his pale hands clenched. Lucy's call about her pregnancy had shaken him, not with doubt, but with a fierce need to protect her. The first letter had been a warning. This one felt like a threat. He thought of Lucy, her mahogany skin glowing in that crimson dress, her strength, a quiet fire he hadn't expected to need. But need her he did, and not just for the child they'd created. She was rewriting him piece by piece. His phone buzzed, snapping him back. It was his assistant confirming a meeting with his father, Gregory Sanders, at the family's Greenwich, Connecticut estate. Charles hadn't planned to confront him today, but the letter changed everything. He grabbed his coat, his pale fingers brushing the paper one last time before tucking it into his pocket. If Eloise was behind this, he needed answers. And if his father knew more than he let on, Charles would drag the truth into the light. The Greenwich estate was a fortress of ivy and stone, its grandeur a testament to the Sanders legacy. Gregory, 62. His pale skin, lined with years of calculated deals, sat in his study, a glass of bourbon in hand. Charles didn't bother with pleasantries. "Did you know about Eloise?" he asked, his voice low, cutting through the room's heavy silence. Gregory raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You'll need to be specific, son." Charles tossed the letter onto the desk, its words glaring under the lamplight. "This, and the one sent to Lucy. Did you pay her to leave me? Did you pull strings to keep her quiet?" Gregory's eyes flicked to the letter, then back to his son. He leaned back, his pale hands folding. "Eloise was a distraction. I offered her a role in London Vice President of International Acquisitions. She took it. You moved on. It was clean." Charles's blood ran cold. Clean. His voice was a blade, sharp and controlled. "You manipulated my life, Dad. You didn't just buy her off. You let her think she could threaten Lucy now." Gregory's jaw tightened. "I protected our name. You were unfocused, chasing a woman who thrived on chaos. I did what was necessary." Necessary. Charles stepped closer, his pale face flushed with anger. "Lucy's carrying my child. She's not a transaction, and neither am I." Gregory stood, his presence towering despite his age. "You think you can rewrite this family's legacy for a woman from Harlem? You're a Sanders. Act like it." "I am." Charles said, his voice steady now. "But not your way. I'm done with your games." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "If you or Eloise come near Lucy again, you'll answer to me." Back in Harlem, Lucy sat on her couch, her dark hands clutching a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Charles had called her after leaving Greenwich, his voice tight but resolute. "I confronted my father." He said the words crackling through the phone. He admitted to paying Eloise to leave. "I didn't know Lucy, I swear." She believed him, not because she wanted to, but because his voice carried a rawness she hadn't heard before. "What now?" she asked, her dark eyes staring at the letter still on her coffee table. "Now I protect you," he said. "Both of you. I'm restructuring my shares in the company. My father's influence ends here." Lucy's breath caught. "Charles, that's your legacy." "No," he said softly. "You and our child are my legacy." She hung up her heart, a tangle of fear and trust. The Harlem night pressed against her windows, its familiar hum, both comfort and challenge. She thought of her mother's words, of the letter's venom, of Charles's pale hand, reaching for hers in the cafe. They were two worlds colliding, her dark skin, his pale resolve. But in that collision, something new was forming. Something worth fighting for. The Harlem church glowed under the Sunday morning sun, its stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopes of color. Across the worn wooden pews, Lucy Brooks, 29. Her mahogany skin radiant in a soft blue sundress, stood at the entrance, her dark curls pinned loosely, a few strands dancing in the warm breeze. Her hand rested lightly on her stomach, where the faint swell of her pregnancy was just beginning to show. The air smelled of polished oak and jasmine from the choir's bouquets, and the hum of familiar hymns wrapped her like a childhood blanket. This was home, her anchor through heartbreak and uncertainty. But today she carried a new weight, the hope of sharing it with someone from a world apart. Inside, the congregation swayed to the rhythm of amazing grace, their voices rising in a harmony that felt like it could lift the roof. Lucy slipped into her usual pew, her mother, Diane, 55, her brown skin glowing with quiet pride, squeezing her hand as she sat. Lucy had invited Charles Sanders, 34. The pale-skinned real estate tycoon, whose life was built on glass and steel, to join her today. She hadn't been sure he'd come. His world was boardrooms and galas, not Harlem's gospel and grit. But when she glanced back there, he was stepping through the doors, his pale face framed by a crisp white shirt and navy slacks, his green eyes scanning the room with a mix of curiosity and reverence. He slid into the pew beside her, his presence drawing a few curious glances from the congregation. Lucy leaned close, her voice a whisper over the music. "You didn't have to come, you know." Charles's lips curved into a small smile, his pale hand brushing hers. "I wanted to. This is your world, Lucy. I want to know it." Her heart stuttered, caught between gratitude and the fear of what it meant to let him in. At 29, she'd learned to guard herself, to keep her Harlem roots close against a city that often judged her for them. But Charles's willingness to step into her space, to sit under the weight of these hymns, felt like a bridge she hadn't expected to cross. The sermon began, Pastor Ellis's voice booming with warmth and wisdom, speaking of faith in uncertain times. Lucy felt Charles's gaze on her, not intrusive, but steady, as if he were memorizing the way she belonged here. After the service, the congregation spilled into the church basement for coffee and homemade pound cake. Diane pulled Charles aside, her brown eyes sharp but kind. "You're here for my daughter," she said, not a question, but a statement. "That means something. But this place, these people, they're her roots. You respect that." Charles nodded, his pale skin catching the light. "I do, Mrs. Brooks. I'm learning what it means to her, to you." Diane's expression softened, a rare crack in her armor. "Good. Keep learning." Lucy watched from across the room, her dark hands cradling a cup of coffee, her heart swelling with something new. Not love, not yet, but trust. The church had seen her through Marcus's betrayal, through the whispers of her pregnancy, and now it was witnessing this. A man from Manhattan's elite standing among her people, not as an outsider, but as someone trying to belong. A week later, the Greenwich, Connecticut estate loomed like a castle of stone and expectation, its manicured lawns stretching under a late afternoon sky. Charles had invited Lucy to a family dinner, a step into his world that felt as daunting as it was inevitable. She wore a deep emerald dress, its fabric hugging her curves and accentuating her mahogany skin. Her curls swept into an elegant updo. At 34, Charles stood beside her, in a tailored gray suit, his pale hand steady on her arm as they approached the grand oak doors. The contrast between them, her dark warmth, his pale poise, drew a subtle tension, a reminder of the worlds they were trying to merge. Penelope Sanders, 60, her pale skin framed by a champagne silk blouse, greeted them with a smile that was polite but guarded. "Lucy, welcome," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "Charles has spoken highly of you." Lucy's smile was warm, but cautious, her dark eyes meeting Penelope's. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Sanders." She handed over a foil-wrapped dish, a peach cobbler she'd baked that morning, its scent of cinnamon and nutmeg, a quiet offering from her Brooklyn roots. Penelope raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "You made this? My mother's recipe?" Lucy said, her voice steady. "It's not fancy, but it's honest." The dining room was a study in elegance, crystal chandelier, linen napkins, a table set for a small army. Charles's father, Gregory, 62, his pale face etched with skepticism, sat at the head. His presence, a storm cloud, waiting to break. Dinner began with strained small talk, art exhibits, city politics, until Penelope's voice cut through her tone, deceptively light. "Lucy, Charles tells us you work in Harlem. It must be different from our circles. How do you find common ground?" Lucy's fork paused, her dark fingers steady despite the sting of the question. She felt Charles tense beside her, his pale hand gripping his glass. "Common ground isn't about circles," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "It's about values, respect, trust, building something that lasts. Those don't change whether you're in Harlem or Greenwich." Penelope's lips parted, her expression softening just enough to notice. Gregory's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his silence louder than words. Charles reached for Lucy's hand under the table, his pale fingers lacing through her dark ones, a quiet defiance. "She's right," he said, his voice firm, "and I'm learning that from her." Dessert was Lucy's cobbler, served on delicate porcelain plates. Penelope took a bite, her eyes widening slightly. "This is remarkable," she said, her tone genuine. "The crust is perfect." Lucy smiled, her mahogany skin glowing with quiet pride. "My mother says you can tell a person's heart by how they share their food." Penelope nodded, a rare warmth breaking through her reserve. "Your mother sounds wise." Later, as Charles and Gregory retreated to the study, Lucy stood with Penelope in the parlor, the fire casting shadows across the room. "I wasn't sure about you," Penelope admitted, her pale hands folded neatly. "But you're not what I expected. You're steady." Lucy met her gaze, her dark eyes unflinching. "I don't come from your world, Mrs. Sanders, but I come from strength. That's enough for me." Penelope's smile was small but real. It might just be. Outside, the Connecticut night was crisp, the stars sharp against the sky. Charles walked Lucy to the car, his pale hand lingering on her back. "You held your own in there," he said, his voice low, admiring. Lucy looked up at him, her dark skin catching the moonlight. "We held our own," she corrected, her smile soft but sure. They drove back to the city in silence, her hand resting in his, two worlds, not yet merged, but no longer apart. The cobbler's warmth lingered, a bridge built on sugar and courage spanning the gap between Harlem and Greenwich. The Upper West Side apartment was a sanctuary of soft blues and warm wood, its wide windows letting in the golden haze of a late Manhattan afternoon. Lucy Brooks, 29, her mahogany skin glowing under the soft light, stood in the nursery, her dark curls spilling over her shoulders as she folded a stack of tiny onesies. The room smelled of lavender paint and fresh linen, a space Charles had insisted on designing himself, its walls adorned with hand-painted stars that twinkled in the evening glow. At 5 months pregnant, her belly was a gentle curve beneath her cream sweater, a quiet testament to the life she and Charles were building. The city hummed beyond the glass, but here in this new home they'd chosen together, Lucy felt a fragile peace, like a melody she was still learning to trust. Charles Sanders, 34. His pale skin catching the fading sunlight, leaned against the nursery doorway, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. His green eyes traced her movements, a mix of awe and quiet resolve in his gaze. The past weeks had been a whirlwind moving Lucy from Harlem, confronting his father's manipulations, shielding her from venomous letters. But this moment, watching her in their shared space, felt like a victory. "You're nesting," he teased, his voice low, warm, like whiskey on a cold night. Lucy glanced over, a smile tugging at her lips. Someone has to make sure this kid doesn't grow up in chaos. Her dark hands smoothed a blanket, her fingers lingering on its softness. "Besides, you're the one who insisted on painting stars at 2 a.m. He chuckled, crossing the room to stand beside her, his pale hand brushing hers. "I wanted it to be perfect. For her. For you." Her heart fluttered, caught between the weight of his words and the world outside that refused to let them rest. Harlem's whispers had followed her neighbors, speculating about her rich white boyfriend colleagues at the community center, tiptoeing around her pregnancy. But it was the online storm that stung deepest. That morning, an anonymous Instagram post had surfaced, a blurry photo of Lucy leaving the center captioned, "She trapped a billionaire. Wonder how long she'll last." The comments were a venomous chorus, accusations of gold-digging jabs at her Harlem roots, cruel guesses about her motives. She hadn't shown Charles, but the words burned a reminder of the chasm between her dark-skinned reality and his pale-skinned privilege. "You're quiet," Charles said, his voice pulling her back. He tilted her chin, gently, his pale fingers cool against her warm skin. "What's going on?" Lucy hesitated, her dark eyes searching his. She wanted to shield him from the ugliness, to keep this moment untainted, but his steadiness demanded truth. "People are talking," she said finally, her voice low. "Online. They think I'm after your money. That this—" She gestured to her belly was a plan. His face hardened, a storm brewing in his eyes. "Show me." She pulled out her phone, opening the post. Charles scrolled through, his pale jaw tightening with each comment. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm not letting them tear you down." "Charles, you can't stop the internet," she said, her dark hands clutching the phone. "And I don't want you fighting my battles." He stepped closer, his pale frame towering, but not overwhelming. "It's our battle, Lucy. You're not alone in this." That evening they attended a gala at a midtown rooftop, a glittering affair of chandeliers and power brokers. Lucy, her mahogany skin radiant, in a sapphire gown that hugged her growing belly, walked beside Charles, his pale hand steady on her back. At 34, he was used to these events, but tonight, his presence was a statement. Whispers followed them, executives eyeing Lucy's dressed socialites, murmuring about her sudden rise. She felt their stares sharp as knives, but Charles's touch grounded her, a silent vow in every step. When the host called for speeches, Charles took the stage unannounced, his pale skin catching the spotlight. The room stilled, glasses pausing mid-air. "Good evening," he began, his voice commanding, but warm. "I'm Charles Sanders, and you all know my name. But tonight, I want you to know hers." He gestured to Lucy, who stood in the front row, her dark eyes wide. "This is Lucy Brooks, my partner, the mother of my child, the woman who's teaching me what strength really means." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Charles pressed on, his gaze never leaving her. "She's not here for my money or my name. She's here because I choose her every day. And if anyone thinks they can judge her, they'll answer to me." The room erupted in applause, some hesitant, some thunderous. Lucy's throat tightened, her dark hands trembling as she met his eyes. For the first time, the whispers didn't matter. She felt seen not as a scandal, but as his equal. Later, in the quiet of Central Park, they walked hand in hand, the city's glow softened by the night. Lucy's sapphire gown swayed her mahogany skin luminous under the streetlights. Charles, his pale suit slightly rumpled, slowed his pace to match hers. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Call me out in front of all those people." "I wanted to," he said, stopping near a quiet bench. "I needed them to know, you're not just in my life, you're my life." Her heart stumbled the words, sinking deeper than she expected. She looked at him, his pale skin catching the moonlight, his eyes raw with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Charles," she began, but he knelt suddenly, pulling a small silver charm from his pocket, a tiny heart, engraved with her initials, and a star for their unborn child. "No ring yet," he said, his voice low, trembling. "I didn't plan this, Lucy. I didn't rehearse a speech or pick the perfect spot. But I know I love you. Not for the baby, not for the world watching, but for you. Will you marry me?" Lucy's breath caught tears welling in her dark eyes. At 29, she'd lost faith in promises, in men who stayed. But Charles, 34. His pale hands, steady as they held hers, was rewriting her story. She thought of Harlem, of her mother's kitchen, of the nursery, waiting for their child. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, messy, and hers. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking, as she pulled him up, their lips meeting in a kiss that tasted of tears and trust. They stood under the park's ancient trees, her dark skin pressed against his pale warmth, the city's heartbeat fading into theirs. The gala's applause, the online hate, the whispers of two worlds, they were just noise now. In this moment, Lucy and Charles were building something stronger, a love forged in fire, ready to face whatever came next. The air in the Mount Sinai hospital room was sharp with antiseptic, and hope, the dim lights casting a soft halo over Lucy Brooks, 29. Her mahogany skin glistening with sweat as she gripped the bed rail. Her dark curls clung to her forehead, her breath coming in ragged gasps as another contraction tore through her. At 8 months pregnant, she hadn't expected labor to come so soon, but the pain was undeniable, a fierce rhythm that demanded her surrender. Beside her, Charles Sanders, 34. His pale skin stark under the fluorescent glow, held her hand, his green eyes wide, with a mix of awe and terror. His tailored shirt was rumpled, his pale fingers trembling as he whispered, "You're doing this, Lucy. You're incredible." The night had started innocently enough in their Upper West Side apartment, where Lucy, her mahogany curves softened by a loose cotton dress, had been arranging books in the nursery. A sudden cramp had stopped her mid-step, sharp enough to make her clutch the crib's edge. Charles, she'd called, her voice steady despite the pain. He'd appeared instantly, his pale face paling further when she said, "It's time." The drive to Mount Sinai had been a blur of red lights, and Charles's shaky reassurances, his hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. Now in the labor room, time stretched and folded, each contraction a wave pulling them closer to a new reality. Lucy's dark eyes locked on Charles, her voice a strained whisper. "I'm scared." She hated admitting it, this woman who'd faced Harlem's whispers and Greenwich's judgment with her head high. But here, in the raw vulnerability of labor fear, was a truth she couldn't hide. "You're not alone," Charles said, his pale hand squeezing hers, his voice steady despite the panic in his chest. "I'm right here." He brushed a damp curl from her face, his touch a quiet anchor in the storm. Hours blurred into a haze of pain and encouragement. Charles counting through each contraction, his pale fingers feeding her ice chips. His voice a constant murmur of strength. Lucy clung to him, her mahogany skin slick with effort, her body a vessel of both agony and miracle. When the final push came, she screamed a primal cry that echoed off the sterile walls. Then a new sound, a sharp, fierce wail that split the room open. The nurse lifted a tiny, wriggling body, her skin a soft blend of Lucy's mahogany and Charles's pale warmth, and placed her on Lucy's chest. Lucy sobbed, her dark hands cradling the baby, tears streaming down her face. "She's here," she whispered, her voice breaking with awe. Charles, 34, leaned over his pale face, wet with tears. He didn't try to hide. Naomi, he murmured the name they'd chosen over waffles and late-night talks, meaning peace. Their daughter's tiny fingers curled against Lucy's skin, her eyes blinking up, a perfect echo of their shared dreams. The nurses stepped back, giving them a moment. Charles touched Naomi's cheek, his pale hand trembling. "She's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lucy looked at him, her mahogany skin glowing with a radiance that outshone the pain. "We did this," she said, her smile fragile but fierce. But peace was fleeting. 2 days later, back in their apartment, Lucy sat on the couch, her dark hands rocking Naomi's bassinet, her body still sore, but her heart full. Charles, his pale skin shadowed with exhaustion, was brewing coffee when a knock came at the door. He opened it to find a plain envelope unmarked, slipped under the frame. His stomach dropped, the memory of the previous letters, Eloise's venom still fresh. He tore it open, his pale fingers unsteady, and read, "You think you've won, but your father's not done." No signature, but the cursive was unmistakable. Lucy looked up, her dark eyes narrowing at his expression. "What is it?" He handed her the letter, his voice tight. "Eloise, she's not letting go." Lucy's mahogany skin flushed with anger as she read, her fingers tightening on the paper. "She's talking about your father. What does she know?" Charles paced, his pale hands running through his hair. "I thought I'd cut him off, restructured. The shares limited his control. But this..." He stopped, his eyes meeting hers. "I need to end this, Lucy. For you, for Naomi." She nodded, her dark gaze fierce. "Then do it. But we do it together." The next morning, Charles stormed into the Sanders Tower in Midtown, his pale skin taut with fury. The boardroom was a fortress of glass and power, but he felt none of its weight today. Gregory Sanders, 62. His pale face, etched with defiance, sat at the head of the table surrounded by executives. Charles didn't wait for pleasantries. "You're done," he said, his voice ablade. "I know about Eloise. I know you're using her to threaten Lucy." Gregory's eyes narrowed, his pale hands folding calmly. "You're overreacting, son. Eloise is unstable. She's acting alone." "Then why does she know your plans?" Charles tossed the letter onto the table, its words glaring under the fluorescent lights. "You've been trying to control me my whole life. Eloise, the company now, my family. It stops here." The board members shifted their whispers, a low hum. Gregory leaned forward, his voice cold. "You're throwing away an empire for a woman and a child." "No," Charles said, his pale face unflinching. "I'm building one. With them." He turned to the board, his voice steady. "Effective immediately, I'm transferring my voting rights to a new council. My father's influence ends today." Gasps rippled through the room. Gregory stood, his pale frame rigid. "You'll regret this." "I won't," Charles said, walking out, the door closing with a finality that echoed like a gavel. Back at the apartment, Lucy sat with Naomi, her dark hands gently rocking the bassinet. Charles returned, his pale skin flushed with the weight of what he'd done. "It's over," he said, sinking beside her. "The board's with me. My father's out." Lucy's dark eyes searched his, her voice soft but firm. You gave up so much. He took her hand, his pale fingers lacing through her mahogany ones. I gained more. You, Naomi, this is what matters. She leaned into him, her dark curls brushing his shoulder. Naomi's soft breaths filling the silence. The letters, the threats, the empire. They were shadows now fading against the light of their family. Outside Manhattan pulsed, but in their home love was the only power that mattered, a bond forged in the fire of betrayal and choice. The Brooklyn Library glowed under the soft spring light, its arched windows framing the quiet hum of Dumbo's cobblestone streets. Inside, white folding chairs were draped with eucalyptus and baby's breath, their delicate scent mingling with the faint musk of old books. Lucy Brooks, 29, stood in a small back room, her mahogany skin radiant against the ivory lace of her wedding gown. The dress was simple, its sleeves tracing her arms like a whisper, the satin waist gently hugging the subtle curve left by Naomi's birth. Her dark curls cascaded beneath a hand-stitched veil, a gift from her mother Diane, who now fussed over the hem with teary eyes. Naomi, 5 months old, cooed in Diane's arms. Her tiny face, a perfect blend of Lucy's mahogany warmth and Charles's pale glow, her pink bow bobbing as she reached for her grandmother's necklace. Lucy's dark eyes met her reflection in the antique mirror, her breath steady but heavy with meaning. At 29, she'd walked through heartbreak, judgment, and threats to stand here, not as the girl Marcus had left, but as a woman who'd chosen love over fear. She thought of Harlem's church, her mother's kitchen, the nursery Charles had painted with stars. This moment wasn't a fairy tale. It was a covenant, a promise forged in fire. Baby, you look like a dream, Diane said, her brown skin catching the light as she adjusted Naomi's dress. Your daddy would have been proud. Lucy smiled, her throat tight. He'd have loved Naomi, she said, her dark hand brushing her daughter's cheek. And he'd have grilled Charles within an inch of his life. Diane laughed, a sound that warmed the room. That boy's lucky he's got charm. In the main hall, Charles Sanders, 34, adjusted his silver cufflinks, his pale skin catching the soft glow of the library's chandeliers. His charcoal suit fit him like a second skin, but his green eyes betrayed a nervous flutter, a rarity for a man who'd faced boardrooms and betrayals with unshakable calm. At 34, he'd rewritten his legacy, not in skyscrapers, but in the quiet vows he was about to make. His mother, Penelope, 60, her pale face softened by a rare smile, straightened his tie. You're sure about this? She said, not a question, but a statement, her voice carrying the weight of their family's fractured past. Never been sure, Charles said, his pale hand steady as he met her gaze. She's my home. The processional began, a gentle piano melody, weaving through the air. The guests, Harlem church members in vibrant dresses, Midtown executives in tailored suits, fell silent as Lucy stepped into view. Her mahogany skin glowed under the light, her dark eyes locked on Charles, who stood at the altar, his breath catching. She was no longer the woman in the crimson dress from SoHo. She was his future, carrying their daughter's laughter and their shared strength. Pastor Ellis, his voice warm, as gospel opened his Bible. Love is not a moment, he said, his eyes twinkling as he looked at Lucy. It's a choice made daily through storms and sunlight. Today, Lucy and Charles choose each other, not because it's easy, but because it's true. The words settled over the room, a blessing that hushed even the skeptics. Charles spoke first, his pale hands trembling as he took Lucy's. Lucy, I was lost in a world of deals and shadows until you walked in. Your strength, your heart, you showed me what matters. I promise to choose you to fight for you to build a life where Naomi knows love without limits." His voice broke tears, glinting in his green eyes. Lucy's dark eyes shimmered, her mahogany fingers squeezing his. "Charles, you saw me not as a story to fix, but as a woman to stand beside. You gave me trust when I doubted home, when I wandered. I promised to love you, to challenge you to raise our daughter with the courage we've found together." Her voice was steady, a vow carved in truth. The rings were simple gold bands, etched with stars, a nod to their nursery. When Pastor Ellis pronounced them husband and wife, Charles kissed her slow and reverent, his pale lips warm against her mahogany skin. The room erupted in applause, Harlem's cheers blending with Manhattan's claps, a harmony of two worlds. The reception spilled into a courtyard, fairy lights twinkling above long wooden tables. Jazz mingled with gospel grilled salmon, sat beside cornbread, and laughter wove through the air. Lucy, her mahogany glow softened by the dusk, fed Naomi tiny bites of mashed sweet potato, while Charles, his pale suit jacket off, laughed with Diane over a glass of wine. Penelope sat beside Aunt June, their conversation tentative but warm, a bridge built over peach cobbler, and shared stories of stubborn children. A week later, the Harlem Community Center buzzed with a different energy. Lucy and Charles had organized a fundraiser, a vibrant blend of gala and block party. Food trucks lined the streets serving jerk chicken and artisanal sliders, while a gospel choir traded songs with a jazz quartet. Lucy, 29, her dark curls bouncing in a sunflower dress, danced with teens from her mentorship program, her mahogany skin glowing with purpose. Charles, 34, his pale skin dusted with Harlem's evening warmth, handed out lemonade, his sleeves rolled up, his smile unguarded. Naomi, in a yellow bow, giggled in Diane's arms, dubbed the CEO baby by the church sisters. The event raised millions for scholarships, but its heart was in the connections. Penelope chatting with Lucy's mentor, Elena, over sweet tea, a teen asking Charles if she could run his company one day. He knelt, his pale hand ruffling her hair. "Start now," he said, his voice earnest. "The world's waiting." As the night wound down, Lucy and Charles stood on the center's rooftop, the Harlem skyline stretching before them, a tapestry of grit and dreams. Her dark hand rested in his pale one, Naomi asleep in a stroller nearby. "This," Lucy said, her voice soft, "is what happens when we choose each other." Charles pulled her close, his pale arm around her mahogany shoulders. "It's just the beginning," he whispered, his lips brushing her temple. Back in their apartment, Lucy stood by the nursery, her dark fingers tracing the stars Charles had painted. Naomi slept, her tiny chest rising, her skin a perfect blend of their love. Charles joined her, his pale hand resting on her waist. "We built this," he said, his voice thick with awe. "No," Lucy said, her dark eyes meeting his. "We're still building." They kissed slow and sure, the city's hum fading into the quiet of their family. Harlem and Manhattan, dark and pale, past and future, they'd forged a love that didn't erase their differences but wove them into something whole, something eternal.